In the last class, we covered the general things like how to fold the hand, genuflecting, lighting candles, basics like that. The one basic I didn't go into in detail was how to open and close the thurible, and we'll do that when we cover benediction. But what we want to do starting today is to cover serving Mass with one server, and then I will go into serving Masses with two servers. So today's section is going to cover half the Mass. We'll go from the beginning of Mass up until the conclusion of the offertory, up to the Sanctus. All right, first thing, and let me say this too, when you are serving with one server, that would be typically a low Mass, and also if you have a Sunday Mass or a Mass that's the equivalent of a sung Mass, a high Mass, then you would have two servers. But also a sung Mass is always two servers, but a low Mass that would be the main parochial Mass can be two servers. So a private Mass would normally be only one server. All right, so what do? You're going to serve Mass. When you arrive in the sacristy, first thing, you come to the church, first thing, make an act of adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, short prayer, and then wash your hands. In the sacristy, if it is a sacristy that has a sink, wash your hands. Your hands should be clean, just like your clothing should be clean and neat and so forth. Then you put on your cassock and surplice. As I mentioned, there is a prayer for putting on the surplice. We talked about how to put on the surplice. Then you make sure that the altar is ready. The altar cards are set up, the candles are lit, the book is put out. Anything on the cruet table, depending on where you're serving. In some churches, the server is responsible for filling the cruets and putting them out on the cruet table. Others, you may have a sacristan that does that, but it's your job to make sure that everything is ready. Then you can go and assist the priest to vest. Now, different priests will have different things that they ask you to do. Some servers will go so far as to present, like the maniple, the stole to the priest. But one thing that typically all writers will say that the server should do is to prevent the cincture. And I don't have one here to show you, but you stand behind the priest. He puts his hands behind, and this would be after he puts on the alb. And when you hand the cincture, you just put it into the hands of the priest behind his waist. He'll hold his hands out, and you have the looped end of the cincture, which is doubled, towards your left, and the tassels to your right. And you just go behind the priest and you present it to him, put it into his hands with the loop to the left, and the bulk of the cincture is to your right. The loop side should be just enough for him to bring it around to the front. And so then he'll secure the cincture. He finishes vesting, and then you present him with the biretta. And when you present the biretta, anytime you present it, hold it out so that the priest can take the middle of the three horns, or the stiff pieces of cloth that come up on the top of the biretta, the three of them. There's four sides, four peaks, you might say four corners. Three of them have these peaks, these stiff parts. Present it so that he can take the middle one. So he puts on the biretta, bow with the priest to the crucifix in the sacristy, and then you precede him out to the altar. When you're going out to the altar, most churches will have a bell or chimes that you ring the bell as you go out to the altar. You come out with the priest, and you will go to the right. And I'll use a cross here for the priest to symbolize the priest. You are immediately to his right. He removes the biretta and hands it to you, and then he genuflects. Now, if it is an altar that does not have the Blessed Sacrament present, the priest will merely bow, but you will always genuflect. Whether or not the Blessed Sacrament is present, your genuflection is a reverence to the crucifix over the tabernacle, over the altar. So you'll genuflect, he hands you the biretta, you genuflect with him, and then you lift with your left hand, you raise the alb so that as he ascends the steps, unless there is no platform on which the altar is placed. Then as he goes up to arrange the chalice on the altar and open the book, you will go over, you'll take the biretta and go over either onto the priest's chair, place the biretta on the chair, or if there's no chair or bench, you can place it on the cruet table. But normally it would go on the chair. Then after you place it there, you will come back, genuflect in the middle, and go to the right, to the left, excuse me. So now you are immediately to the left of center. And this is going to be your general rule for your position when you're serving. You are opposite the book. Now, of course, at the beginning of the Mass, the book is on the right side of the altar, what we call the epistle side of the altar. So that's why after you receive the beretta and place it here, you'll come back, genuflect, and you'll go to the left. You'll wait for the priest to come down. When he comes down, he genuflects, you kneel. And you kneel on the floor. So for the prayers of the foot of the altar, you're kneeling on the floor. And then after that, during Mass, you're always kneeling on the first step. Now, if the altar is on a platform where there are no steps, there is only the platform on which the altar is placed, then you would kneel on the floor. But if there's more than one step, more than the platform, you kneel on the lowest step after the prayers of the foot of the altar. So you're kneeling here for the prayers of the foot of the altar. Now here's a general rule. Anytime the priest, speaking out loud, says something in which he makes the sign of the cross, you make the sign of the cross with him. But during the canon, when the priest makes the sign of the cross, you do not, because he's speaking in us silently. But when he speaks out loud, you follow his rubrics for bows, signs of the cross, etc. So, prayers of the foot of the altar, the priest begins, in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, Amen. You should make the sign of the cross in unison with him. You go through the psalm Iudica Me, you go through the responses. After that psalm, there is another sign of the cross. Adiutorium nostrum in nomine Domini. Our help is in the name of the Lord. You make the sign of the cross with the priest for that sign of the cross, and then he bows over and recites the Confiteor. You remain kneeling erect, kneeling up straight for the Confiteor. After the Confiteor, you bow, a bow number 2, angled towards the priest. So you're right here, you're going to bow number 2, and you're angled towards the priest, and you say the Misereatur when he concludes the Confiteor. He says Amen, and then you will turn straight facing the altar and bow a little more deeply. So it's a bow number 3, and you recite the Confiteor. During the Confiteor, there's twice where you angle slightly towards the priest. And that's the first half, it's when you come to et tibi pater, and the second half towards the end when you say et te pater. You'll just angle slightly towards the priest. Those words mean and to you, Father. So it's and to you, Father. So you're bowed, facing forward, and then you just angle slightly each time you say those two words, et tibi pater and te pater. Of course, you strike your breast, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, at those words of the Confiteor. At the end of the Confiteor, you remain bowed. The priest says the Misereatur, you say Amen, and you kneel up erect. And then he says the Indulgentiam, you make a sign of the cross with him and say Amen. Then he will bow slightly, and that's a number 2 bow. You bow with him. Deus tu conversus vivificabis nos, and the remaining versicles and responses, there are 3 or 4 of them after the Misereatur to conclude the prayers of the foot of the altar. You'll bow number 2, facing forward, and then when he says Oremus, you lift the alb as he goes up the steps. Then you'll stand from this position here. You'll stand after he goes up the steps. Stand, turn to the side, you go to the left, and then you'll kneel down on the lowest step. Position for kneeling should be where you're straight across from the edge of the altar, not too far to the middle and not way to the side. So it's going to depend in each church on the size of the altar, but the point is, prayers of the foot of the altar, you're right next to the priest. After the prayers of the foot of the altar, you'll stand, turn to the side, and kneel down on the top. Now you are kneeling there for the first part of the Mass. The priest, after he kisses the altar, will go over here to the book, and he begins the introit with the sign of the cross, and again, it's out loud. You make the sign of the cross with the priest. If it is a Requiem Mass, he makes a sign of the cross over the book. He does not sign himself, so you would not sign yourself. You're following again the priest. So you'll just keep your hands folded at the introit of a Requiem Mass. So he makes a sign of the cross on himself. Normally, for the introit, you do so. Then he goes to the middle, says the Kyrie, you respond. Then he says the Gloria in Excelsis Deo. And he bows his head at Deo. And several times during the Gloria, and also I forgot to mention, during the introit, there's a Gloria Patri. He turns to the tabernacle and bows his head to the cross above the tabernacle at the Gloria Patri. You will do so as well. That's a bow number one, a bow of the head for the Gloria Patri, and then those words in the Gospel, Deo, adoramus te, gratias agimus tibi. When the priest bows his head, you can do so, bow number one. The end of the Gloria, you make the sign of the cross. When the priest does, he kisses the altar, he turns around, Dominus vobiscum, you say et cum spiritu tuo. He goes back to the book and he reads the oration. Has his hands out. At the end of the oration, he closes his hand, bows his head, and says the conclusion. At the end of it, you say Amen. And then he puts his hand on the book and says the epistle. Now, there may be additional orations, one or even two additional orations. Another thing I'll just point out briefly is there are a few times in the year, certain Ember Days, and also a couple of times during Lent, where there are additional lessons before the epistle. And you will know when to say Deo gratias at the end of the lesson or the epistle, because the priest holding his hands on the book will put his hand onto the altar, will touch the altar. So that indicates to you. You can also tell by the inflection of his voice when he's concluding the epistle. But notice for that, when he touches the altar, you'll say Deo gratias, and then you'll stand, you'll come to the middle, genuflect, and you'll go around to change the book. Now, I will just say, normally the priest will instruct you on those few days of the year where there is an additional lesson or lessons before the epistle, as far as when to get up and go change the book for the gospel, move it to the other side. You do not do so after those preliminary lessons. Again, the priest will tell you.